Okay, so I'm going to be talking about histamine today, a small molecule which, among other things, functions as a neurotransmitter. So here are a couple pictures of the structure of histamine. It is an organic molecule with a nitrogenous base. This is two-dimensional and three-dimensional. So before I get into histamine as a neurotransmitter, I'm going to talk briefly about how neurotransmitters work in general. So an action potential will trigger the release of neurotransmitters in a neuron. So once released, neurotransmitters go across the synapse and bind to the postsynaptic cell, which triggers a response in these cells. They then go through the process of reuptake, where they are reabsorbed into the presynaptic cell, ready to be released again and cause another reaction. So histamine is created from the amino acid histidine by the process of decarboxylation. So the amino acid histidine loses a carboxyl group, which results in histamine. Histamine is stored in mast cells and basophils, which are types of white blood cells. The non-mast cell histamine are the ones that are used as neurotransmitters. So immunoglobulin E triggers the release of histamine, and once released, histamine will bind to G protein-coupled histamine receptors. There are 4 types, and I will get into those in more detail. So this image right here shows how histamine is triggered. So something will result in immunoglobulin E being released, which will then result in histamine being released. So histamine has a variety of functions and is not only a neurotransmitter. So one of the most well-known roles of histamine is its role in the immune system and in inflammatory responses. So histamine will cause capillaries to become more permeable to white blood cells. So in an immune response, histamine will get triggered and released, which will cause the capillaries to become more permeable. So at the site of infection, more white blood cells will rush in because of this permeability. And this plays a role in allergic reactions. When the body finds an allergen, histamine will get released, which causes the permeability of the capillaries, which will result in things such as the runny nose, watery eyes, even anaphylaxis. Another function of histamine that is not so well known is that in the stomach it stimulates the parietal cells, which are the cells that result in hydrochloric acid being released. So that is important in the role of digestion. So as a neurotransmitter, histamine has a variety of functions. It is found in the posterior hypothalamus in the turbomammillary nuclei. Sorry about that. But afterwards, after it is released, it can extend throughout the brain into the cortex and the medial forebrain bundle. So as a neurotransmitter, histamine plays a role in wakefulness and sleep prevention, which is what this image is talking about. So the release of histamine with the H1 receptor, which I will get into, results in wakefulness. It also has some suppressive effects. So the role of histamine with the H3 receptor can actually suppress neuronal functions, some types. Another possibility is that histamine might control the mechanisms by which memory and learning are forgotten. It might also reduce seizure activity, and in the hypothalamus, it can result in neuroendocrine responses, so hormones in the brain being released. As well, histamine is involved in food and water intake, so it plays a role in the physiological control of appetite, and dipsogen, which causes thirst. It is also involved in thermoregulation, regulation of glucose and lipid metabolism, and control of blood pressure and pain relief. I really like this image. It's a very general diagram of what histamine can do. So it can be involved in gastric acid secretion, vasodilation, which is dilation of blood vessels. Sorry, my bad. Oops. Wait, here we go. So this kind of shows just in general what histamine can do. So you can take a look at that. Okay, so as I've said, there are 4 histamine receptors. The first, and they're aptly named H1, H2, H3, and H4 receptors. So H1 receptors in the central nervous system play a role in all of the neurotransmitter functions that I previously mentioned. In the peripheral nervous system, it is found in smooth muscle cells and the endothelium, which are part of blood vessels, and and H1 receptor can play a role in such things such as bronchoconstriction, which is the airways in the lungs being constricted, smooth muscle contraction, vasodilation, which is the dilation of blood vessels, and allergic reaction symptoms such as hives and pain and itching from insect stings, as well as motion sickness. So this diagram right here kind of shows how the H1 receptor functions, especially in neurotransmitter functions. So the other types of histamine receptors, H2 receptors, are the ones that play a role in the stomach, so they're the ones that lead to gastric acid secretion. They also are found in vascular smooth muscle cells, which can lead to vasodilation. H3 receptors, which I mentioned, can actually play a role in decreased neurotransmitter release. So this kind of shows how the H3 receptor works, and it can result in the opposite it can result in suppressive outcomes. Finally, H4 receptors are the ones that are in an immune response. So they are found in basophils and bone marrow, and they result in mast cell chemotaxis, which is the movement of mast cells to a site based on a chemical signal or reaction. So histamine plays a role in a variety of diseases and disorders. So obviously it can play a role in immune system disorders. If there's too much histamine being released, that can cause a lot of problems. Its role in allergies is fairly well known. When the body encounters an allergen, histamine is released, which causes allergic symptoms. Something interesting that I found, and this is a little bit more neuro-related, is that histamine actually plays a role in such diseases as multiple sclerosis and schizophrenia. So right now its effect is being studied as a possible treatment for multiple sclerosis. So histamine is involved in T cell differentiation with respect to H2 and H3 receptors. So as a treatment, maybe if the T cells are able to differentiate more, they will be less likely to attack the body's own cells, such as the myelin sheaths, which in multiple sclerosis are degraded. Kind of the opposite is that H1 and H4 receptors increase permeability in the blood-brain barrier, which causes inflammation and worsening multiple sclerosis symptoms. So if that can be prevented, that might be a possible treatment for MS. Also, there is a correlation between levels of histamine in schizophrenic patients. So there are increased metabolites of histamine in patients with schizophrenia. Something else that's found is that in schizophrenic patients, H1 receptor efficiency decreases. So there is a correlation there. Finally, antihistamines can oppose the activity of histamine receptors and block the effects of histamine in the body. So the two main types of antihistamines are the H1 antihistamine and the H2 antihistamine. H3 and H4 antihistamines are being studied, but they're not as well known or as well used. So H1 antihistamines are the ones that are used in allergic reactions. they can prevent such, the nasal allergic reactions. They can stop like the runny nose, things like that. They are also used to prevent motion sickness and vertigo. H2 antihistamines are used to prevent gastric acid problems, because remember, H2 histamines are the one in the stomach, which are involved in digestion. So here's a very general image of how antihistamines work and the number of things that they can prevent. So that's just a general overview of histamine, not only as a neurotransmitter, but just in general. Thanks for listening.